All right. My work with queer theory in American religion is actually a little bit odd because I am an early modernist by trade, and so this paper that I have is more of a personal activism for me. But we'll see how it goes. Okay. In recent years, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, afterwards referred to as the LDS Church, and also more popularly known as the Mormons, has garnered national attention for its conservative stance on gender and sexuality. In this paper, I will explain why the LDS Church holds some of its views on gender and sexuality, and thus why it encourages some types of conversion therapy, by analyzing the rhetoric of male sexuality in a talk given by Boyd K. Packer, a senior member of church leadership and one of the church's most outspoken homo-antagonists. In the October 1976 General Conference, and General Conference, by the way, is a semi-annual worldwide meeting of Mormons broadcasted to members of the LDS Church, in which prominent church leaders speak and give revelation to the church. The Apostle Boyd K. Packer gave a speech entitled "To Young Men Only," which was soon published in pamphlet form and distributed widely to young men throughout the LDS Church. Despite the fact that the LDS Church has disavowed some of the claims that Packer makes about homosexuality in this talk, the pamphlet is still available at the church's website, categorized along with other material for teaching and leading young men. In his talk, Packer uses LDS doctrine regarding the relationship between the spirit and the physical body to talk about male sexuality and create an argument for queer, but specifically gay, conversion therapy. Before we begin analyzing his theories of male sexuality and conversion therapy, however, it is necessary to present the LDS views on bodies and spirits, which are slightly different than most other Christian teachings on this subject. The relationship between the spirit and the body is best explained by the LDS.org website, which states, "God is the Father of our spirits. We are created in His image. We have a divine nature and destiny. Before we were born, we lived with God, the Father of our spirits. All persons on earth are literally brothers and sisters in the family of God. Our life on earth has a purpose. Coming to earth is part of God's plan for us to gain a physical body and learn to choose between good and evil. Following God's plan for us is the surest way to find happiness and endure life's challenges. Our lives will not end when we die. Our future lives are determined by the way we live our lives now." According to LDS doctrine, spirits are eternal beings that were created long before the world was created and that continue to exist eternally. Spirits are not immaterial. Rather, they are made of a material that is simply too fine for human eyes to see. While most body and spirit divides in Christianity are used to reinforce distinctions between heavenly and earthly realms, this divide in Mormonism does not exist quite the same way in LDS doctrine. The body is seen as fleshly and more susceptible to certain sins, but it also plays a vital role in heavenly exaltation. The separation of body and spirit during death is not a moment of freedom for the spirit, rather a moment of loss and imprisonment until the spirit can be reunited with a physical body made perfect and eternal through the power of God. While the body is beneficial in LDS doctrine, after all, it would be impossible to live on earth and prove one's worthiness without a body. It is also susceptible to many evils, just as other Christian religions teach. It is for this reason church members are taught to discipline their body and to think of the relationship between between the spirit and the body as a relationship between master and servant, or as a lifeless glove and a commanding hand, as was in a previous example. This is something that is used to teach children about the relationship between the body and the spirit, is that you get like a winter glove or something, and the glove is the body and your hand is the spirit. You put your hand in the glove, and that's body and spirit combined. It's a really simple object lesson for children. So the body on one hand is necessary. It's also dangerous, though. The body is essential, but it's flawed. The body is a wondrous gift, but can also be a gateway to terrible sins. It is this paradoxical understanding of bodies and spirits that Boyd K. Packer draws on in "To Young Men Only," as he walks the infinitesimally thin line between praising the body as a necessary tool and condemning the body as a pathway to carnality and sin. He speaks of the body as both subject and object, good and evil, natural and mechanical, though it is not apparent if he means to present such a complicated and contradictory concept of the body. Yet it is not Packer's fault for presenting inconsistent bodily rhetoric. Rather, I argue that this conflicted relationship between the body and the spirit exists less as a holy mystery or divine paradox of the LDS religion, and more as a result of the church being a young faith that has not yet resolved the central incongruities that lie at its foundation, and likely would not currently stand to benefit from resolving these incongruities. I also argue that this conflict between the body and the spirit, as well as the inability to prove a solid identity for the body and the spirit, is at the heart of the church's misunderstanding of sexuality. Boyd K. Packer's homo-antagonism, and the dangerous belief that queer sexualities must be treated as diseases, perversions, or spiritual tribulations. Despite this, or perhaps because of this, the body teems with potential of every kind. This potential is expressed by the many allegories and metaphors that Packer uses to speak about the body and its relationship to the spirit. At times, these metaphors emphasize the body's rebelliousness. As Packer says, a young man should learn to rule his body. Like his temper, he should keep it always under complete control. That sometimes is not easy to do. So the body must be under the spirit's control, because the body is wild and disobedient by nature. Comparing the body to one's temper, and a very stereotypically masculine temper at that, Packer emphasizes the unpredictability, power, and danger of an uncontrolled body. Yet in the same breath, he also celebrates the body's ability to bring about positive spiritual progression. Your body is the instrument of your mind and the foundation of your character. It has within it powers which, if properly used, will contribute greatly to your exaltation. If you use this gift worthily, it will serve you throughout all eternity. Here, the body is an instrument, a foundation, and a gift. These metaphors cast the body as an inanimate object that requires an agent in order to make it useful. In addition, the agent can access power that the body holds, although this power can be abused if accessed unworthily. These metaphors appear to present a unified, if not depressing, view of the body's passive purpose, but they also illustrate the confusion surrounding the body's relationship with the spirit. While elsewhere, Packer refers to the spirit as the agent of the body, here, the body's agent is the mind, the character, and a generic you. Because the LDS Church has no official doctrine regarding the relationship between the mind, the character, and the spirit, it is difficult to tell whether these function as stand-ins for the spirit or as something else that we simply haven't structured yet. Packer does not stop to clarify these new roles, even as he continues to employ more metaphors in his exegesis of the body. As a result, the body begins to accumulate new and unexpected meanings and to take on relationships with other entities that do not fall within his spirit/body dyad. He returns to the mind in two further images, both of which add another player into the mind-spirit-body tangle, and this player is thoughts. In the first image, Packer likens thoughts to the water that irrigated the orchard that he tended as a young man. One day when he began to irrigate the orchard, the water began to flood out of the ditches because they were choked with weeds. A neighbor came through the orchard. He watched for a moment, the neighbor, watched for a moment, and then with a few vigorous strokes of the shovel, he cleared the ditch bottom and allowed the water to course through the channel he had made. If you want the water to stay in its course, you'll have to make a place for it to go, he said. Thoughts, like water, will stay on course if we make a place for them to go. Otherwise, our thoughts follow the course of least resistance, always seeking lower levels. It is clear that in the context of this talk, lower levels are a euphemism for sexual thoughts. In the simile, thoughts are, like water, neutral, flowing, agentless. What is missing from this simile is who is responsible for controlling thoughts. Who is the generic we that must make a place for them to go? And how do they fit into the spirit-body-mind thoughts structure that has been created? His next image of the mind as a stage does little to clarify the relationship between the spirit, mind, body, and thoughts, though it does reinforce an anxiety regarding chaotic entities at play in the body. This time, thoughts are envisioned as rogue actors in a play. The mind is like a stage. There is always some act being performed on that stage. Have you noticed that without any real intent on your part, in the middle of almost any performance, a shady little thought may creep in from the wings and attract your attention? These delinquent thoughts will try to upstage everybody. If you permit them to go on, all thoughts of any virtue will leave the stage. You will be left, because you consented to it, to the influence of unrighteous thoughts. This characterization of thoughts is very different from the previous characterization in the irrigation metaphor. While both thoughts as actors and thoughts as water require an authority figure to keep them in line, thoughts as actors seem determined to cause chaos, and therefore to have more agency. As actors, these thoughts have the capacity to make their own choices, unlike they did in the irrigation metaphor. Perhaps Packer's most memorable metaphor is the description of the male body's reproductive organs as a factory. This is where it gets really fun. Here, the process of creating semen becomes mechanical. This little factory moves quietly into operation as a normal and expected pattern of growth and begins to produce the life-giving substance. It will do so perhaps as long as you live. It works very slowly. That is the way it should be. For the most part, unless you tamper with it, you will hardly be aware that it is working at all. As you move closer to manhood, this little factory will sometimes produce an oversupply of this substance. The Lord has provided a way for that to be released. It will happen without any help or without any resistance from you. Perhaps one night you will have a dream. In the course of it, the release valve that controls the factory will open and release all that is excess. The factory and the automatic release work on their own schedule. The Lord intended it to be that way. It is to regulate itself. I don't know how accurate that is, but anyway. This extended metaphor of the body as a mechanistic factory directly contradicts Packer's previous image of the body as disobedient and difficult to control. The fact that the body regulates this process by itself suggests a kind of self-awareness that functions apart from the spirit. This self-awareness waits until sleep to, as Packer words it, release the valve, suggesting that in some aspects, the body does not need the spirit to control it. It is important to note here that Packer is not a Marxist. His figurative language about factories is not a commentary on the commodification of sex. Instead, this factory comes across as a fantasy of capitalism, a self-regulating factory effortlessly and endlessly producing a generative substance that will, in a perfect heteronormative scheme, produce even more factories. In a church that is known for its fiscal conservatism, immense wealth, and Republican leanings, what more could someone want from a body? But unlike the other moments in which Packer emphasizes the body's disobedience and the spirit's need to control it, here the roles seem to switch. It is the spirit that causes mischief to the body's little factory. He says, perhaps a young man is encouraged by unwise or unworthy companions to tamper with that factory. He might fondle himself and open that release valve. This you should not do, for if you do, the little factory will speed up. You will then be tempted again and again to release. It looks like he has experience here. Without the deviancy of the spirit, the factory could continue producing according to schedule. But because of the spirit, the factory is sped up and runs the risk of releasing more than only that which is excess. And it's important to note here that Packer's background is in religious, is in religious education. He has no official training in anatomy, reproductive biology, or human sexuality. So according to his logic, masturbation is wrong because it speeds up the factory to desire more releases, thereby depleting the necessary store of semen and ruining his capitalist fantasy of factories producing even more factories. Packer's fear of masturbation is predicated on a flawed belief that masturbation will automatically lead to infertility, thereby destroying the fantasy of infinite reproduction. This same fear generates his hatred of sexual relations between men. In an oft-quoted passage, Packer tells a disturbing story about an experience he had while serving as a general authority. And general authorities, that's another role that you can have in upper leadership in the church. While I was in a mission on one occasion, a missionary said he had something to confess. And Mormon missions are slightly different because you are combined. Everyone here has seen Book of Mormon the musical, actually? Mm-hmm. Probably. Okay, if you haven't, I haven't either. I need to. You are, in a Mormon mission, you are paired with one other companion of your same sex. And you work together, and you live together, and you proselytize together, and so you spend a lot of time with that other person. His story. While I was in a mission on one occasion, a missionary said he had something to confess. I was very worried because he could just not get himself to tell me what he had done. After encouragement, he finally blurted out, "I hit my companion." "Oh, is that all?" I said in great relief. "But I floored him," he said. After learning a little more, my response was, "Well, thanks. Somebody had to do it, and it wouldn't be well for a general authority to solve the problem that way. I am not recommending that course to you, but I am not admitting it. You must protect yourself. There is a falsehood that some are born with an attraction to their own kind, with nothing they can do about it. They are just that way and can only yield to those desires. This is a malicious and destructive lie. From our premortal life, we were directed into a physical body. There is no mismatching of bodies and spirits. Boys are to become men, masculine, manly men, ultimately to become husbands and fathers. No one is predestined to a perverted use of these powers. Even those who have been drawn into wicked practices and are bound by almost unyielding habits can escape. If one of you seems trapped in that escape, go to your father or bishop, please. Your parents, your bishop, the servants of the Lord, the angels of the heavens, and the Lord himself will help redeem you from it." The fact that Packer shares a story of the assault of a gay missionary immediately before he recommends young gay men to escape their sexuality is not by chance. Most of the church-sanctioned conversion therapy that took place on LDS-owned college campuses in the 1970s used shock therapy and other violence that sought to punish the body in order to cure homosexuality. Packer claims that bodies and spirits are not mismatched, but this even puts further blame on the body, hinting, as he claimed earlier in the talk, that the body's experience in prepubescence can misdirect a young man's normal desires and pervert him not only physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. The body takes the brunt of the blame for homosexuality, and thus must suffer the brunt of the pain necessary to return to an imagined state of innocent heterosexuality. Packer's simplistic solution of blaming and punishing the body for homosexuality fails to recognize the immensely complicated network of relationships between the body, the spirit, the mind, thoughts, and character that he himself constructed in his talk. This complicated network of unstable entities does not at all point to a simple cure for homosexuality. If Packer were to look a little closer at his own characterization of the human as a shifting, chaotic, disruptive network of entities, he might realize how truly queer his understanding of the human is. Before Packer and other members of the LDS Church that support conversion therapy assume that the body ought to be blamed for homosexuality, I suggest that they explore the queerly complicated concept of the human that they themselves have created in LDS doctrine. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I must begin with a qualified expression of regret and apology. My title promises discussion, in part, of conversion and essentialized roles as reflected in tags in folksonomies for online erotica. And my initial abstract promised that I would specifically consider the user-generated tags and rankings of the Narcissus Cursed Men collection, the NCMC. Unfortunately, that site no longer exists. Since the time I submitted my proposal and now, that online forum was discontinued. Its stories have been migrated over to a different site, Gay Spiral Mind Control Collection, gayspiralstories.com, and are being curated by a new host, but elements of their associated metadata seem to have been lost. Nonetheless, the discussion that follows will conclude with a reflection on the significance of the loss of the NCMC user-generated vote-based rankings, considering some of the literature on collaborative metadata production relative to queer folksonomies and erotic corpora. And we will still consider some of the stories hosted on gayspiralstories.com and their associated tags, because some of the metadata survived. Okay. So, this talk will be about conversion narratives. Conversion narratives are familiar in my home discipline, religious studies. But one might usually expect an altar call or a come-to-Jesus moment, not magical dildos turning jocks into twinks, and new club drugs turning bros into bottom boys. But that is part of what makes these conversion narratives so interesting. However, before talking about features of these narratives, I'd like to reflect, as Foucault might, on conversion as a religious and indeed mystical exercise in the context of the medieval church. Foucault traces the transferal of the care of the soul from the priests to the therapists. That, put simply, the confessional booth is transformed into the psychiatrist's couch. In this context of thinking critically about conversion therapy and an online queer response to a therapeutic culture that is a secularized form of an anti-sodomistic confessional culture, it's appropriate to think genealogically for a moment. In particular, I would like to think about the many women who embraced the austerities, mortifications, and disciplines of the religious life in order to perfect themselves. At its core, their desire was erotic. They wished to perfect themselves in love, to deify themselves in perfect love of the God who is love. For love, they underwent grave pains and exertions, truly significant deprivations and sufferings, as intense as in any BDSM or grad student community. Fasting, limited sleep, limited sensory input, monotonous ritual actions, memory exercises, visualization exercises, dwelling at times on things like the torments of hell and Jesus' passion. In fact, they made themselves sick with love, suffering in a fittingly Foucauldian manner that harkened back to the classical equation of love and madness, and that was identified as melancholy or lovesickness. Thus, the mystic, like the gay, is sick with love and longs to be transformed. But for the mystic, this sickness and these pains are not merely symptoms, but actually medicinal, the means by which they may heal themselves, restoring in themselves the imago Dei, the image of God. And yet, they felt throughout this process that without divine illumination, without God's grace, all this effort would prove fruitless. So they sought to alter themselves, to become a new self, or as Paul would say, put on the new man. Teresa of Avila, in the book of her life, repeatedly refers to feeling like she was becoming a new person. Yet, the mystics were finally dependent on another being, an outside self, to generate this new self within them, an outside self that was their Lord and God, and in unity with whom and in whose image they sought to be transformed. Thus, they sought unification with and even displacement or possession by God. To set up the principal analogy to queer life that will guide the rest of this talk about gay erotic texts of transformation and conversion, I specifically choose to focus on the female mystics, even though the male ones could serve reasonably well. Certainly, others have written on the homoerotic character of the male mystics seeking union with their male lord, not to mention putting on the drag performance of their female soul relative to Jesus, their husbandly master. By humbling and indeed humiliating themselves, by taking on the female role under their lord, they imitated the enormous humility of the son's kenosis. But still, they remained male in a hierarchical society that privileged males. So thinking of female mystics as analogous to drag kings allows us to reflect on the more subversive power play involved in their self-transformation. Drag, then, will be the secondary, though perhaps more generally familiar, analogy for what is happening when people create and consume the stories on these online forums. And we will be thinking of drag, too, in terms of modification and even displacement of the self. That is, as comparable to ecstasy, trance, possession, and so on. This is a rather atypical lens through which to consider drag, but it allows one to focus on the manner in which these texts permit one to modify the self, while also inviting critical thought about whether consumption and production of these texts, as well as the analogized phenomena, really qualify as strategic essentialism. Now, let's step away from female mystics and drag performers for a moment and think more carefully about the relationship that obtains between narratives and the self. Damasio, in his discussion of the wordless narrative that is the foundation of the conscious verbal self, beautifully asserts that we are the song while the song lasts. Other humanists and social scientists have pointed to the narrative constitution of the self that both empowers and constrains us. And cognitive narratology has given much attention to the role of theory of mind, our capacity to model other selves within ourselves, in making literature possible. Consideration of a plurality of selves reminds one that the self is not one. The supposed unitary self is really made up of a variety of conflicting and coordinating impulses, desires, intentions, and so on. And reading hijacks our capacity to contain multiple selves within ourselves, supplying us with alternative ways of being that may be integrated into or even displace the self. Although conversion therapies have increasingly fallen into disrepute, a society that posits medical and religious ideals of restorative therapy and thereby defines straightness in terms of health sets up the conditions for a fantasy-motivated countermove that can be observed on the ground among gay writers. That is, whereas certain Christian-influenced medical organizations insist that gay people can be converted into straight people and can be disciplined into adoption of gender-stereotypical behaviors, gay authors, especially through speculative fiction, can depict the opposite, magical and scientific transformations of stereotypical straight characters into gay versions, often through discipline in a distinctly erotic mode. Using the associated tags, let's consider some examples from stories formerly hosted by the NCMC, focusing on the author known as Bodily. Although the ranking information that NCMC used to track has been lost, Bodily was a popular author, and Bodily's work may be treated as a fair representative of the subgenre. Many of his corpus's tags reflect this fact, relating simply to the type of text found on the website, that is, text dealing with the transformation of the erotic self, either through science or magic, from straight to gay. By considering the tags, one may trace the stages of this progression. The character begins as straight, and perhaps as an embodiment of idealized and culturally venerated normativity, or even supernormativity, right? So we have superheroes that are turned gay. These straight men are sometimes marked for transformation due to being homophobes. The plot occurs in various settings, but the transformation follows a regular trajectory. The character being transformed is clueless of what is happening and may become dumber as the story progresses. Reflecting the wish-fulfilling aspects of these narratives, the theme of humiliation is rather common. The character is becoming the queer other he despised. The transformed gay man may retain his cisgender masculine qualities, and they may even be amplified in some respects. But more often, even the exaggerated muscles of the transformed are meant to signal and materialize an exhibition of sexuality. Other very popular tags are exhibitionism, public, things like that. The transformed is a slut, shamelessly reveling in and overcome by sex. Moreover, the new gay self embraces his femininity, valorizing qualities that are stigmatized by misogynistic cultural norms. Some of these tags are effeminate, princess, sissy, bimbo, shaved, twink, bottom. And his transformation may even include turning him into a member of a marginalized race or profession. So some of the tags are stripper, pool boy, Asian, Latino, and robot. The transformation is embodied in a variety of ways, some of which are deeply implicated in the capitalist order that has profoundly and inevitably inflected contemporary queer identities. Bodily uses a number of narrative techniques, for example, providing privileged access to the character's internal narrative, vivid descriptions of the character's mannerisms, actions, clothing, and so on, to support imagination of the gradual transformation. The transformation is generally effected through involuntary or external powers of magic and science, although as the character transforms, he tends to adopt disciplinary practices that advance his transformation. The fact that it's clueless emphasizes its involuntary character, as well as the diminished rationality and enhanced hedonic embodiment of the new self being generated. The involuntary aspect of transformation may be read as analogous to the role of grace in medieval mysticism. God's alien will acts from outside the awareness and even the desire of the mystic to make transformation possible. However, the mystic also operates within a tradition that supports and scaffolds her transformation. The character embodies and materializes the new ideal self, and the reader participates in this, repeatedly imagining and contemplating, not saints and angels, but characters who are proud, sluts, sissies, and fags. Patrick McNamara, in his The Neuroscience of Religious Experience, proposes that the generation of novel selves lies at the heart of the various religions and the experiences they cultivate. He suggests that in religious ritual, the executive self is taken offline or decoupled, and then a search is conducted in semantic memory or suppositional space, which he calls the possible world box, for a more ideal self. The two are then bound and integrated in what resembles a specialized version of conceptual blending. Reading fiction puts one into just such a decoupled state, and the body of erotic text read by gayspiralstories.com community, in addition to those offered by other cultural channels, supplies possible worlds from which readers may derive new selves more integrated with their queer possibilities. Along these lines, we may note what Morris and Sounson observe in their chapter, Discourse and Identity in a Corpus of Lesbian Erotica. The discourses evident from these texts are of lesbians as powerful, sex-positive women, and they draw on the identificatory and behavioral possibilities offered by postmodern notions of the fluidity of gender. The magazines which provide material for our corpus seem to have forged new symbolic territory for lesbians to explore. They manifest a necessary creative redesignation of language to cope with the inversions and complexities of lesbian gender and sexual practice being acknowledged at the start of the 1990s. The findings presented in this chapter suggest that lesbians have finally arrived at what Zita terms lesbian authorship of self. Morris and Sounson use corpus linguistics to determine keywords in their texts, identifying in an automated fashion central concepts like those picked out by social tagging. The fact that their conclusion is so similar to the one we have arrived at by looking at the corpus of a representative gay male author in an online erotic collection is encouraging. How, though, may we understand stories like these in terms of critical consciousness and political power contestation? Spivak supplies the notion of strategic essentialism, and it is in this context that it may be fruitful to consider the example of drag kings and queens, the power of turning oneself over to another self, one that glories in being a heightened version of what is condemned or denied. Drag performers materialize the border contestation of gender at the heart of queer identities. They make explicit the performative nature of gender with its attendant sex role associations. While those who read, imagine, and identify with the erotic fantasies hosted on sites like gayspiralstories.com may rightly be compared to those who, for example, practice the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Drag performers embody their alternative identities in a much more intense and public fashion. Indeed, though they acknowledge that they are performers, that they are, in a sense, playing, many speak of their drag identity as supplying them with strength, and the queer community likewise draws strength from and attributes a degree of reality to its drag performers. It is a courageous thing to act in a manner that is desired but despised, and many can only do it in imagination or on special holidays like Halloween that give transgression a playful sanction. Strategic essentialism suggests that we know what we're up to, as we nonetheless draw on the power of the very roles and rules that have been used to oppress us. The ways online community members tag user-generated texts according to a communal folksonomy, and the relation of these categories to the narratives they index, may be read as a topping from the bottom, as it were, whereby stigmatized performances of identity within a small world of marginalized people may be made salient in order to be, and because such performances are being valorized. Moreover, since a folksonomy is not a controlled hierarchical vocabulary implying a unitary perspective, it can support the multiplicity and perspectivalism characteristic of the queer community. Instead of living in the silence imposed by the normative categories of the dominant culture, the queer community can use folksonomies, in spite of their issues, to make their valued categories known and accessible to like-minded ones. Extending Beraut's argument, this topping from the bottom points to the value of queer erotic texts as records of gay struggles with dominant power regimes and for liberated identities. Indeed, as we have seen, in many of these texts, the familiar SF theme of human self-transcendence is realized through a carnivalesque overturning of straight, gay, femme-masc, and related hierarchies. Thus, the tragedy of the loss of even a portion of NCMC's metadata. Finding aids are ways for people to mark as special the things people find significant. They are guides for those like them to discover them as well. Categories may trap and constrain us, but used strategically, they may help us to become the new self we wish to be.
Thank you. All right, before I start, I just wanted to say please feel free to live tweet. I'm a big fan of that. That's my Twitter handle right there. And that's my website. And I thought I'd start with a joke. I don't know how well this will go, but I'm going to give it a shot, right? So I'm talking about trans men actors, acting method, acting techniques, acting pedagogy, right? These ideas, right? What it is to be a trans actor. And as I was looking for what a trans men's acting method might be, I came across some interesting threads. It seems that it involves being white, having dark hair, being able to sit in a chair, look down at the floor, kind of dejectedly and sad. And that seemed to be a method of some kind. And I am very good at this method, as you can see. Right? But that all got kind of exploded because I found out actually you can be blonde and look up, and it still works, right? That's Scott Schofield. Okay, but I'm going to just jump into this. It's a lot more complicated than that, of course. So this paper is part of an ongoing exploration of trans men's phenomenological experiences. I reinscribe trans men's embodiment as an area that can be creatively mined by trans men actors, and I pivot this kind of phenomenology in resistance to expectations by theater pedagogues and casting directors for what actors' bodies should look like, or how actors should use their bodies, or should be able to use their bodies. Okay? A dysphoric trans man's body already resists the expectations of cis-heteronormativity. There is already a dynamism in that non-normative experience of the body as it encounters a cis gaze, the play of absence and presence. What is or is not in that person's pants is in hyper-focus under a cis gaze. Right? The other side of cis expectation is an embodied resistance that the trans man controls to various degrees. Either consciously or subconsciously, a trans man has an ability to redefine the boundaries of physical presence into a metaphysical presence. And that metaphysical presence can be pathologized in phenomenological terms as absence. In theatrical performance, metaphysics of presence and absence are positioned inside the language of stage presence and stage absence, or what experimental actor and director Joe Chaikin called absent time, and that's in his book Presence of the Actor. In redefining absence as presence, trans men resist the pathology that they should be made to feel more like cisgender people or cis actors, right? If dysphoria is a kind of metaphysical absence that we are simultaneously present in, trans men actors can therefore resist the conception that stage absence is negative, useless, undynamic, and just plain bad acting. I contend that within trans absence exists a resistance that is in itself dynamic, reactionary, emotional, sexual, validating, empowering, and vibrant with life, all of the things that would be considered stage presence. So my paper challenges pathologized conceptions of transsexuality that consider dysphoria a problem to be fixed. Acting is a particular area of the body where acting is a particular area where a body is expected to be fully engaged in order to have stage presence. Traditional actor training espouses bodily unity, unobstructed access to all parts of the physiological and expectedly able body. And within this expectation, an alternate, non-normative bodily experience is an obstacle to overcome, unhealthy, unwhole. Traditional acting methods pathologize unwhole bodies, favoring wholeness, rooted in cis-heteronormativity and ableism. The bodily unity concept contradicts a trans actor's particularly queer or queerly particular embodied experience. Trans actors encounter the stage in a Halberstamian queer time and place. I don't always identify with Halberstam, but in this case I really do. I really like this idea of queer time and place. So trans actors encountered this queer time and place on stage with psychic metabodies, reconstructive surgeries, and practical prosthetics, objects of dis or reappearance. Combining Drew Leder's phenomenological theory of disappearance, and that's dis with a Y, disappearance, which is the disappearance of parts of the body from the rest of itself, with Joe Chaikin's concept of fragmentation in disabled bodies, I indict cisnormativity in established training methods, but also create a queer time and space that invites a new generation of queer-bodied actors to the stage. Okay. So I'm a female-to-male transsexual, and I'm also an actor. I'm interested in the lived experiences and the kinesthetics of trans men performers and how we negotiate space in or outside of a stage performance context. My theories emerge from these queer phenomenal embodied experiences of dis and reappearance, and I tie together phenomenology with technique. Trans men's acting technique not only allows for, but incorporates bodily awareness, which I'll come back to later. I'm going to go away from awareness and come back to it. I refer to this also as disappearance, as it is on the slide, in ways that do not perceive absence as unhealthy. In this paper, I discuss specific experiences of my own body and performance practice. Some of the things I'm working through are common experiences to other trans men, but by no means can there be one overarching transmasculine bodily subjectivity. The idea that transgender is as simple as, quote unquote, being trapped in the wrong body is a common misconception and dangerous misinformation. It is impossible to say that trans subjectivity is any one thing, but through my subjectivity as a trans actor who has a body in space, something complicated is happening there, and that's in and out of performance environments. And such a complexity is counter to most established approaches to an actor's body. As I'm describing it, trans embodiment is fragmented with regions of the body that appear, disappear, and reappear in different ways. When trans body parts disappear, psychically or surgically, other parts can appear. And These emerging replacements are material or non-material prosthetics. And so this is what I'm referring to. Is pretty specific to the transmasculine behavior of packing, which involves a physical prosthetic, but trans men also project metaphysical body parts, which I believe is a similar experience to phantom limb syndrome, but this is an area that I am going to explore further in the future. I have not fleshed out that segment of this as it exists right now. But I'm not sure if everyone knows what packing is, but it's a prosthetic that represents male genitalia. This is from the Trans Guy's website. That's a demonstration. You would not wear it outside of the underwear if you don't know, but he's just showing how it would be worn. And I think that this is something about the prosthetic and the projected body that an actor can use. I'm not talking about just a sexual genital connection here, but there's something complicated in the embodiment of that, right? So to actors using traditional actor training methods, bodily absence is troublesome. In Bodily Absence, a concept in phenomenology defined by Maurice Merleau-Ponty as an awayness from the body, Drew Leder describes that, quote, the body may emerge as an alien thing, a painful prison or tomb in which one is trapped. Separation can occur from and in opposition to the body. The experienced self is rent in two as one's own corporeality exhibits a foreign will. Therefore, the body can be away, apart, asunder from itself, end quote. Awayness is translatable to gender dysphoria, and that's still the diagnosis. It's what used to be gender identity disorder, and the diagnosis is a persistent discomfort and inappropriateness of the assigned gender and its non-cooperation with the body. What Leder calls absence is most similar to my experience of trans embodiment. In this, I redefine absence from emptiness and separation into space and dynamism or dynamics. The underlying concepts of this paper are disappearance and reappearance. Right? Drew Leder wrote about what he called disappearance, again with the Y, right? A phenomenon in which the body distinguishes itself during dysfunction or illness. I develop a theory of transgender subjectivity as experienced kinesthetically in embodied practice. My hypothesis is that trans men experience dissociation with areas of the body as a part of dysphoria, but this dissociation, frequently called disembodiment, is not actually a bad thing in general, and especially not for an actor. Like the Hegelian theory of a body separation from itself in instances of pain, a transgender experience of the body is similarly non-cooperative. According to this model, the recalcitrant body is separate and opposed to the I, quote unquote I. In pain, there is a negation within the organism itself, not between the organism and a separate thing. The communication between self and body forms the embodied self. Transgender is the consequence for embodiment and subjectivity. As Gail Salomon writes, quote, when the relation between self and skin is not one of ease and euphoria, but discomfort and dysphoria, end quote. Dis, with the Y, also appears as Gail Salomon exemplified in gender dysphoria. The body away from itself reflects the split between mind and body that can be described as transsubjectivity. This language is also strongly reminiscent of the diagnoses for gender dysphoria, as mentioned previously, the persistent discomfort and inappropriateness of the assigned body and its non-cooperation with the self. So a trans body has areas that disappear and later reappear, body parts that intentionally or subconsciously recede from direct experience. The zones where problematic parts are situated become isolated voids. For example, for many trans men, the chest is often entirely off limits for any interaction, but many acting techniques require meditating on the solar plexus as a point of origin. Again, a trans embodiment, though complex, is not, quote unquote, a complex. I'm questioning how to approach or reapproach acting methods as an actor with gender dysphoria, which is a possible bodily experience for an actor to have. By calling it dysphoria, I am referring to diagnosis, not pathology. Diagnosis identifies the nature of transgender by examining symptoms, but a pathology of transgender would look for a cause. Before he worked with fragmentation and disabled actors, Joe Chaikin called for an immediacy of the inner self in his book, The Presence of the Actor. Chaikin claimed that an actor must be present in the body, that the body must be awake in parts and whole. While making this call for unification, Chaikin also discusses the inner workings of the actor's body in what he addresses as absent time. Chaikin describes absent time as a kind of zoning out, which is equivalent to a form of disappearance that Leder refers to as awayness. Right? To Chaikin, absence is anathema to presence. The body is essentially sleeping, not a particularly active task for an actor. Philip Zerilli is another practitioner invested in presence, and much of his work is inspired by Leder. So I'm actually kind of reading Zerilli, reading Leder. Zerilli works against what he calls the normative disappearance of the body, which is another way of describing what Chaikin calls absent time. So these are really the same phenomenon, normative disappearance of the body or absent time. This is the awareness, the disappearance that happens to really what they're referring to as general for everyone, but that just means cisgender people, right? This is also something very specific to trans people all the time. And what Chaikin and Zerilli are saying is that when this happens, you have to fix it or you're a bad actor. That's what they're saying. So Zerilli's method of breath that flows through the lower regions requires access to those regions. It's a primary exercise that Zerilli does, that energy flows through your whole body, right? And it's actually really common for a lot of acting methods and embodied practice technique, right? But this is something that cisgender or non-dysphoric actors may take for granted. The disappearance in these regions, it's common experience for a trans man because the locations necessary for tracing breath through the abdomen, the chest and pelvis, may be consciously or unconsciously removed from direct experience. Zerilli wants absent space to be inhabited as part of the performance process, but my contention is that trans absent spaces form an alternative kind of bodily wholeness. The alternative trans whole body has empty spaces which create a fragmented human form, and I contend that the fragmentation is the healthiest and most peaceful version of embodiment for many trans people. Therefore, the idea of bodily unification requires a new definition when considering trans men. I have a section here that I'm going to skip about Munoz and queer utopia. I don't feel like I need to labor on it, but there is a lot of utopian thought that goes into this project. Just going to move forward beyond it. Okay, so as a person, a trans man with a body, I have areas that appear, disappear, and or reappear, and this is abstract and hard to explain. This paper is an ongoing project as I explore how disembodiment can be practically utilized for actor presence. Exercises designed for trans men could involve bidirectionality and open positive resistance, such as weight transfers. In a weight transfer, balance sits in one site and then becomes absent as the weight flows to another site. I would seek to replicate double or multiple embodiment, like a trans man's projected self, metabody, as opposed to the prerequisite unified body. At the ATHA conference in 2014, I co-presented a workshop that tried out some of these exercises, and a particularly successful exercise incorporated Viola Spolin's space substance, which describes forming objects made of space. In this work, space substance is considered real, not imaginary, much like the metaphysical parts trans men sometimes psychically project, and because those are real objects too, not imaginary. These are from that workshop, especially in the one in the top left, you can see an object coming into being, right? It's a real ball that she's holding, not affecting the shape of a ball that's invisible, right? It's a real thing in space. So I aim to continue to get input from practitioners and trans men, actors and non-actors, and to be part of the larger and ever-expanding discussion of queering actor training, especially now that trans men actors are starting to be seen and moving ever onwards towards queer utopia. Thank you.
Okay, I'm noticing the time, so I want to open it up to questions straight away if you have any. Otherwise, thank you very much for all of your essays, all of your work. One thing that I was thinking that connected all of your work is obviously the body and transformations in this notion of cyborg, right? With the factory and so on. I really like that image, actually. I think that's hilarious. So I was wondering if you wanted to speak towards embodiment or performativity as you see it working across your essays. Yeah, I would say So the Mormon Church is very slow on the uptake sometimes as to what's going on in the world, which is really fascinating because it has created some spaces for transgender Mormons to actually be accepted in weird ways that are not so. It really depends on who your regional leaders are. It depends on what they know about things. It depends, again, on how visible it is on the body. You know, that's part of it. That was something that I was thinking of as you were talking about how, about trans actors and acting. I don't know. That would be something because the body is so important in Mormonism, and yet at the same time, a lot of the doctrine does not keep up to date on what bodies are doing in the world. So there is this like really fascinating relationship as to how this plethora of bodies that are transgressive and moving and wonderful and amazing and confusing actually gets funneled into Mormon doctrine.
Well, I was just thinking too that in terms of you're talking about how visible had the readability of it, right, which certainly factors in for trans men who are looking to get cast, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Sure.
And there are folks who audition stealth and get roles. But my concern with it is that there's this overwhelming idea that just exists, it's pervasive. It's what acting is, that actors can do anything, right? If you want them to be a tree, they'll be a tree. If you want them to be an animal, they can do anything, and that means that you have to be able, your body can do anything. And, well, not all bodies can do all things, right? And I think it's something to actually be, to articulate that, right? And that has happened in disability, and it hasn't quite happened with queer performance and specifically trans acting, right? So, whether or not somebody's passing, there's definitely something really dynamic going on, whether or not it's readable, right? Yeah.
Well, I guess I was trying to get at some of these notions of embodiment by invoking some of the cognitive science literature, right? Because what's happening to people when they read these erotic stories, right? Anytime we activate, the language network, it activates all sorts of sensory motor, rich sensory memories and all of that, so that these texts are always playing with our kind of embodied consciousness that is rooted in our experience in the world. But then this transformative aspect, right? What's happening, you see it in mystical context. You see it in the mystics were trained to do all sorts of visualization exercises, like I mentioned, right? Contemplating different passages in the Bible, really trying to materialize them, imagine interacting with them, contemplating, the image of Jesus or the saints or whatever, right? And by strengthening, right, their imaginative powers, it leads to this kind of spontaneous, embodied experience where they would have, visions and also some of the more extreme, like, I implied kind of kinky things that they're doing to themselves of the more rigorous mortifications, right? Also push the body into that place where it can, where the mind can start embodying other things. And so I think it's neat to see similar practices being engaged in by queer communities, who are trying to imagine alternative selves for them. They don't want to become Jesus, right? They don't want to become God the way a mystic did, but they're trying to materialize different ideals for themselves, right? Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question for Apple. So you talked about the pamphlet for
course not. No. So I run an online Facebook group for queer Mormon women and queer Mormon non-gender conforming, genderfuck, genderqueer individuals. And a common narrative that most of us share is growing up Mormon in the church and feeling so great because we weren't tempted by sexual urges in the way that other women were. Like, I was so righteous. I was so righteous. And it was, and this narrative of being able to go on dates with boys and being able to kiss them and whatever, but feeling in perfect control because there's no attraction there. And then just suddenly, having some relationship with a woman or with a non-heteronormative relationship, and suddenly you realize, oh, hey, there actually is something there. At least from a sexuality, from a sexual experience. I in my experience being raised LDS, women's sexuality doesn't really quite exist. It's not something that's talked about frequently. Young women, at least how I was raised, and what I was told in church, and what most of these people in this, the women in this group that I'm running will talk about, is that women are seen as, they're portrayed as being able to be more in control of their desires, of their passions. And it's our responsibility to dress in certain ways, to act in certain ways, to say certain things to make sure that we keep men where they need to be. And it's really wonderful in some ways, because just as, in the Bible condemns man laying with man as he lays with woman. It doesn't say anything about women laying with anyone. And so it's this weird, on one hand, it's this wonderful invisibility of, technically it's not, there are a lot of Mormon theorists that say, like, oh, well, in order to have sexual relations, there must be a man there, like a penis there. And so, like, as a married woman, married to a woman, like, I would still be a virgin in some ways. So there's this wonderful invisibility that works sometimes really well, and other times it's really crushing. Because a lot of the stuff that's going on in queer Mormon communities is about cis gay white men, and is very concerned with that. So yeah, there is nothing about that for young women. Specifically, on occasion, I remember one lesson about that for young women, but the attitude was more of that it was a guy issue than a women's issue. And that's what I've noticed overall as I've talked to other women, is this surprising lack of knowledge and resources for queer women and queer non-gender conforming people in the Mormon Church.
I guess I have. Do we have time? I have questions for both of you, actually. So, your talk made me think of. So I don't know if have you read The Refiner's Fire? It's this book about Joseph Smith and his kind of magical training,
right.
and the ways in which kind of the goals of Mormonism and a lot of it practices, a lot of the early phenomena come out of early colonial kind of hermetic traditions and esoteric kind of knowledge of alchemy and astrology and kind of folk magic, right? And so this goal, right? One way of thinking it, like when you made the comment about, or actually it was when you quoted his comment about how a boy who is misusing his factory or whatever is kind of he's disrupting this path of kind of transformation, right? That should lead to becoming this patriarchal God, right? And so, like this magical ideal of transforming yourself into God, and like all of that. I was wondering if you could go into a little more about how you think of it. Think of this discussion of presenting an alternative notion of the human, right, would
Right.
fit into a cosmological system that kind of has a telos, right? Like
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something to keep in mind in Mormon theology is that God does not mean one male God. God means a goddess and a god. Again, it's a young religion. We're still figuring things out. So it would be a exalted woman and an exalted man, resurrected, made perfect, married, sealed together in the temple. That is a god, right? And that is, I think, that is probably one of the, because the goal of Mormonism is to prepare you, to put you on that path, right? Which is where you get all the fun stuff in the Book of Mormon about how, like, we all get our own planets, you know, and whatnot. But that is the goal of Mormonism is, I mean, there's a scripture that says, as God was, men now are, right? So that men and women, you know, parentheses, and women, are gods in embryo, right? And this was something that I thought about and struggled with for a very long time, because if you're Mormon, you believe that, and then there is no room for any sort of queer sexuality or gender at all, because heteronormativity extends into the eternities.
Right.
But I think what I love about the idea of a god being plural, there's also the belief that polygamy is in the next life, and so sometimes when we say a god, we mean one male deity and many female deities. But I guess what I'm fascinated is the concept of friendship, which I don't think has enough traction in the Mormon Church. What I've really appreciated reading is Michel Foucault's Friendship as a Way of Life. And I like the idea of multiple deities being involved in this creation of matter. And I think that in Mormon theology there should be room, because there's already room for having multiple women in this creation of a god. I think it would be fascinating if we could expand it to just have any sort of group of friends, if that makes sense, you know, in order to do that, so that it would be open. It would be open for any genders. It would be open for any sexualities or asexualities, and yet it would still maintain this sort of interhuman connection. And friendship and love that seems to be present in a lot of, seems to be at the heart of many Christian religions and at the heart of Mormonism. But that's something, I mean, that's my own like fun theological dreams for Mormonism, and I can't imagine that happening anytime soon. But that's something that I think that's where I would imagine this going, maybe.
Awesome. And then I was wondering for you this notion of kind of these practices you showed at the end of materializing the space, objects in space and stuff is so, it also made me think along magical directions, right? Because, I mean, neo-pagans and other esoteric ritual magic traditions, right, are very comfortable with like they're trying to train the imagination, make it really strong to the point that they're kind of materializing things, right, in the world, and that playful boundary, like the boundary gets, where is it real, is it imagination, right? It becomes so vividly real that that becomes slippery, right? And so I was just wondering if you had any thoughts of how kind of what the space you're marking out for trans embodiment, and how they're using these techniques, how that would relate to maybe some of these other practices that other communities use to.
That's interesting. I think that maybe the only difference that I can articulate at the moment is that it seems like in the mysticism that it would be on a conscious level of materializing like making something material out of absence or something, right? Which is something that I'm trying to sort of generate as a technique, right, that a trans person could use. But there's the level of awareness of that, I think is certainly of various, various degrees but among individuals. But I know a lot of people, trans people, who it's not even a reality. Like there is or is not a part that is there or is not, no matter what other people say or what doctors say, right? So the reality it is as fleshly as an angel is, right? I mean, it is like, it is there,
Right.
and the reality of that is also very visible to partners. Like, there's an object that is attached physiologically that is otherwise invisible, right? But it's not about like, I'm imagining that, or I'm like gonna say it enough until you believe me. It's like, no, this is life, this is real. And it's just not really considered as legitimate of a body, right? It's a struggle. That's why it's so hard for a lot of trans people, right? Is that to have to constantly express that it's really there. Where to that person and to people who are getting that, like, it's not about like a practice, it just is, yeah? But I'm wondering, how do I turn that into a method, right? Like, and that varies of like how comfortable someone is with that idea, right? Because that's not everyone can handle. Yeah.
We might have time for one more question, if anyone